A very good afternoon to everyone present here. My name is Hannah Sarsujan, and I'm a third-year student here at SCMC. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the first day of the Changing Landscape of Indian Media, a series of lectures on the digitalization of Indian media. On occasion, by the 75th anniversary of India's independence, the Symbiosis Center for Media and Communication, Pune, and the Birmingham City University, UK, is organizing a week of events and discussions around the theme, the changing landscape of Indian media. As part of the event, the series consists of academic discussions, retrospective film special events, and industry panel discussions spread over 3 days. As part of the event, we're also glad to organize a panel of eminent academic and industry experts on the theme of digitalization of media culture in India at 75. Discussion will aim to renew the urgency of understanding the factors and consequences of change that contemporary Indian digital media culture represents. Today's discussion, with the theme Digitalization of Media Culture in India at 75, is chaired by Dr. Baidurya Chakrabarti, the head of Department for the Audiovisual Department at the Symbiosis Center for Media and Communications, Symbiosis International, Deemed University, Pune. We're also honored to have with us the panelists for the event. We have with us Professor Madhuja Mukherjee, Professor for the Department of Film Studies in Jadavpur University, Kolkata, and an eminent filmmaker. Professor Rajendra Durgal, Professor of Cultural Studies and Creative Industries, and the Interim Associate Dean for Research, Innovation, and Enterprise, the Faculty of Arts, Design and Media at the Birmingham City University. We also have with us Professor Vipul Parthasarathi, the Associate Professor for the Center for Culture, Media and Governance at the Jamia Millia Islamia in New Delhi, as well as Dr. Vibhuti Duggal, the Assistant Professor of Film Studies, School of Culture and Creative Expressions at the Ambedkar University, Delhi. The next day in the 3-day series of events will be held on the 4th of May. And on the 4th of May, we will have with us Professor Gayatri Chatterjee, an eminent film scholar and the author of numerous books, such as Mother India and Avara, to give us a brief overview and engage us in an enlightening discussion on the career and journey of Rishikesh Mukherjee. We will also have with us on the day SNN Ahuja, the Senior Vice President of Content at Fantico and one of the largest collectors of Indian film memorabilia, who will be tracing the journey of Indian cinema for us by introducing us to the intricacies of the history of the Bombay film industry through the exhibition of exceptional examples of film memorabilia. On the 6th of May, we have with us an industry panel discussion on the media, culture, and digital transformations in India at 75, which will be chaired by Professor Amitabh Dasgupta, the head of Department for Journalism at the Symbiosis Center for Media and Communications. The panel will be discussing the impact of the data-driven media economy and the fragmentation of content due to the democratization of audience accessibility of content. It will also look at themes such as the consequences of the rise of OTT platforms, the preference for regional content, and the overall global and digital transformation from an industry perspective by industry experts. The panelists for that event are Swadhin Padhi, the head of production at the Ronkel Institute, Mumbai, India, Ms. Rashmi Lamba, the India Council lead, Gina Davis Institute on Gender in Media, as well as a filmmaker, producer, festival director at Mumbai, India. Sunil Raman, the India lead for state advocacy and external relations at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He was also a political journalist based in New Delhi. We also have with us Ashish S. Kulkarni, the founder of the Punaryug Art Vision, as well as the forum chairman at Pune, India. And we also have with us for that panel event, Supriti Malhotra, the assistant professor and the AEP faculty in charge at the Symbiosis Center for Media and Communications, Pune. I would now like to welcome Dr. Sriram Gopal Krishnan, the director of the Symbiosis Center for Media and Communications, to inaugurate the event with his welcome address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Hannah. You can hear me?
Yes, sir. Can hear you.
Good morning in UK and good afternoon in India. It is my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Symbiosis Center for Media and Communications. I welcome all the speakers at this event and thank them for accepting our invitation. The response to this event, the changing landscape of Indian media, has been quite good, with registrations by students from various colleges. Our industry and academic partners are also responded to our invitation, and I take the opportunity of welcoming them also and thank them for their patronage. We like to believe that SCMC is the #1 undergraduate media college in India, not just because we have an acceptance rate of 5 to 6% with over 3,000 applications, not because our students have 3 internships of a total of 6 months in a 3-year degree. We are the foremost because we have a unique culture, academic rigor, skills orientation, faculty expertise, and experiential learning. Landscape is an appropriate word for this occasion. Such a geography will have its soaring heights, verdant growth, but also have these funny holes and dangerous ridges where things just disappear. That way, Indian media is multilingual. It is almost like having a couple of Europes all stuck in one peninsula. Perhaps we need more CLM events to understand it. India's digital footprint has grown because it is the cheap telecom costs, an often unacknowledged legacy of previous governments. Also because free data from an Indian billionaire in search of a monopoly, all which shows that our growth in digital media is an important milestone. There was a time when we used to think of monopolies, and in the 1980s, the concern was about newspaper chains like Knight Ridder and Gannett and how they're taking over the world. That didn't happen. I guess we have different type of monopolies up right now. And I'm sure, I guess some things don't change. It just keeps coming back in a different avatar. And I'm sure CLIM as a platform will successfully engage in much of the issues that face us. But for our students, it's a wonderful opportunity to listen to globally renowned speakers and researchers, academics who have made their mark in the entire studies of media. I'm sure we will be enriched by that interaction. Once again, I welcome all of you to the changing landscape of Indian media and request Hannah to take the proceedings forward. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much, sir, for inaugurating the event. We now have with us Professor Rajinder Dudra, the Professor of Cultural Studies and Creative Industries and the Interim Associate Dean for Research, Innovation and Enterprise, as well as the Faculty of Arts, Design and Media at Birmingham City University. We now welcome you, sir, to give us an address. Thank you so much.
Hello, Hannah G. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the behind the scenes organization. Good morning from England, UK, and good afternoon and namaste to all of you joining from wherever you are around the world. We're really, really thrilled and pleased to be hosting this event as a co-event with SCMC Pune. So really thank you very much to my wonderful colleagues, Vedriya and Supriti, and thank you, Sri Ramji, for that wonderful opening. We're really, really thrilled that BCU is a partner with SCMC. And this happened, you wouldn't believe it, maybe several months ago when we met on an online call and we decided to think about possible initiatives between the UK and India and between our two organizations, not least in the 75th year of celebration, what this means for progress, what this means for development, what this means for looking back critically perhaps, but also looking forward. And this is where we came up with this idea of the changing landscape of Indian media. And I must say that the colleagues at SCMC Pune have really been first rate in terms of the organisation, professionalism and skills. So thank you very much to all the staff and students behind the scene, colleagues like Hannah, Suprati Vedra, who've really helped make this happen. So at Birmingham City University, I've just stepped down as the interim associate dean, I'll be glad to say. So one less huge administrative task for me to do, so I've stepped down to that. But I am the Professor of Cultural Studies and Creative Industries at Birmingham City University, where I teach across subjects like film, media, cultural studies, digital humanities, popular music, and I kind of research on various research grants and projects. At BCU, I arrived in 2016, and in 2017, we set up our BCU India group. This was really to consolidate and bring together a number of colleagues across the university, both in the arts and humanities and in the natural sciences, to think about all our projects under one umbrella group, one umbrella organisation, to do with India. So whether that was India in the subcontinent or whether that was India in the diaspora. As I'm sure as many of you will know, there's a huge population of India diaspora the world over, but particularly in the UK. And I'm very proud to say that the city that I'm in Birmingham, there's a wonderful, thriving Indian community of various linguistic registers, different cultural, caste and creed presenters. So the plurality that is India in India also lives and thrives overseas. But the media is also important because it can also be a conduit. It can also be a form of communication, and particularly as we move into the digital realm. So I'm really excited and looking forward to the panel discussion and conversations today. So please do join in with your questions and comments. We hope it will be a stimulating conversation. And for more details of our BCU India group, just go to the Birmingham City University website and type in the search engine BCU India group. And there you will see the range of areas that we work in, from the arts and creative industries to my area, to augmented reality, virtual reality, to fashion and textiles, flood risk management, sustainability, and so forth. So once again, welcome on behalf of Birmingham City University. Really thrilled, and it's wonderful to be collaborating with our colleagues at SCMC Pune. The weather is 15 degrees here. I know it's really warm in Pune, so I'm just hopefully sending some breeze your way so that we can have nice, cool proceedings. And I understand we're going to show a short video now, if that's still correct, a video that's been put together by the students at SCMC. So back to you, Hannah, thank you.
A huge thank you for putting up event, that video. All right, so now we have with us a brief overview of today's discussion. Today's discussion will be about the digitalization of media culture and India's shift towards a digital automized structure consisting of its own historical intricacies and possible futures. The historicity of these discussions are also key to understanding the changing landscape, while also provoking discussions on the periodization of Indian digital media, as well as the obsolescence and emergence in contemporary Indian digital media culture. With a keen eye on the contemporary state of digitalization of media culture, especially in India, the debate would also center upon potential new questions that might need to be asked in order to grasp the dynamism of the changing landscape of digital media culture, as well as its impact on the user communities across the world. It gives me great pleasure to now introduce to you the chair for today's panel discussion, our very own Dr. Baidurya Chakravarti, the head of the department for our audiovisual department here at Symbiosis Center for Media and Communications. Sir is an assistant professor He has been awarded doctorate degrees in the field of cultural studies from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad in 2016. Sir has also been published in reputed journals like Studies in South Asian Film and Media, as well as other anthologies. If any of you have ever sat in Sir's class, it's truly a pleasure to be there. So, Sir, I'd like to welcome you to the event.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay. Okay, let me, so today I am going to chair the panel on digitalization of media culture in India at 75. So welcome all. Let me first introduce you to the panel members today. We have with us Professor Madhuja Mukherjee from Jadavpur University. I will talk about her a little bit later. We, of course, have Professor Rajendra Dutra from Birmingham City University. We just heard from him. We have Professor Bodh Parthasarathy from Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. And we have Dr. Bibhuti Duggal from Ambedkar University, Delhi. But before I go into anything else, let me just give a brief sort of an introduction just to, sort of start to organize our landscape of thinking a bit. Now, we wanted this event to be more of a sort of a provocation towards renewing thought rather than actually coming up with full and final, thought, the sort of end product. Our thought was, we have tried to keep it as open-ended as possible so that we can have a sort of plural perspective into the matter. But the thing that really interested us was that the fact that, I mean, the question of digital media is nothing new in India, although sometimes when you read the work that is done on digital media, it seems like people forget that. At the risk of broadly generalizing, one can say that the work on digital media till now has either been on a certain kind of a study of transitions from analog to digital, or older format to the newer, and the questions of what is lost, what is gained, the similarities and the differences, and so on and so forth. And then there is of course the question of the opportunities that digital media offers in terms of sort of audience reach, marketing, etc., which is another field. But we thought that the entry point to our discussion would be the fact that we need to we need to acknowledge the fact that even digital media by now is nearly 4 decades old, if we start from the 1980s, and by now it has had its own sort of historical development. We all know, of course, that new technologies always produces new subjects, new subjectivities, new ways of being and belonging, and as well as alienations. That part we have always known about the digital media, but it is also true that there are certain digital medias that has also passed away. There are certain experiences that are no longer available, and so on, and there are new things that are coming up. So we were thinking that rather than thinking of the digital as a sort of explosive transition, which is usually the sort of narrative trope in which people deal with the question of digital. Can we think of it by now as a stable sort of state with its own history and so on? And from that vantage point, when we look at Indian media, what are the things that are to take cognizance of at this point, given what has been going on right now in the year 2022, after 2 years of COVID and so on? So that is really where we want to start our journey from. But anyway, I don't want to speak too much today. It's not my job to talk. But let me introduce our first speaker here, which is Professor Madhuja Mukherjee. Madhujadi, how do I introduce her? She has been, hi Madhujadi, can you hear me? Okay. Now, to give an official introduction to Madhujadi, she's a professor of film studies at the Jadavpur University, as you heard. She has written many books. One of her earliest books, I think, was on new theaters, published by coincidentally, our event partner, National Film Archive of India. It's a book that I've gone through, like, from the first page to the last page. She has produced an incredible anthology called Voices of the Talking Stars, sort of singular work in the sort of, the bibliography of Indian film studies, and so on. She has written many books, but she is also perhaps one of the very few film studies scholars who can claim at a sort of holistic engagement with theory and practice. She's a very eminent filmmaker. She's a graphic novelist, and she is an extremely, generous person. We have all enjoyed the fruits of her generosity. So with that, I think I will hand it over to Madhujadi. But we can't hear you, I think.
Vidurya, should we go to another colleague whilst Madhu sorts out her audio?
Yeah, I guess that would be better, right? So, so Rajita, would you want to pick it up from here while Madhujadi fixes?
I didn't realize that was my cue to come in. Okay, I should have kept quiet. Okay, I'll come in. Hello, Madhuja, if you can hear me, lovely to be on the same panel with you again, especially after so many years. So I really do hope we get to see and hear you because it's been way too long, the pandemic not least. So I thought I was going to come a bit later on in the panel, but I'm happy to speak now. So the format is, as Badurya says, we're all going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes each, and then Badurya will chair the session and have some Q&A with us, and then the floor will be open for your comments and questions as well. But obviously, if you don't feel okay coming on the screen and asking you questions, please do put them in the chat box, and our colleagues at SCMC, Pune, will channel the questions to the chair as well. Okay, so digital media landscape, but there is absolutely right. It's not a recent phenomenon. Although I think what has been happening is that the exponential increasing use of digital media has perhaps been on the rise, and there's certain statistics on various global reports and audits have shown this around the world, not least in so-called developing areas of the world, and not least, of course, right across India as well. And I think also what's interesting is our understanding of digital media, social media, new media is quite increasing as well. And that's quite important for us, particularly in a context like today, and with our students at SCMC and at BCU, who are both making projects in and through the digital media, but also who are thinking about this. And really, in terms of thinking about the digital media, I want to talk here from the vantage point of the diaspora, particularly myself with ethnic and cultural roots from India, from the north of India, from the Punjab, and traveled to various parts and had friends and families in various parts of India, but also how the diaspora in India, so that is second, third, fourth generation now, even my nieces and nephews as they're growing up, who are increasingly drawing on cultural resources, on popular culture, on televisual, whether it's Netflix, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Z5 and so forth, where they're drawing on these references for points of popular culture and entertainment. Now, why might that be the case? Well, let's think about the issue of representation. The digital media is really important when we think about representation. So who is representing whom? Who is telling stories about whom, and who gets access in front of the screen and behind the digital productions as well. This is also complexified because I suppose in the analog age, or even maybe 20, 30 years ago, it was largely men, and it was largely certain types of men of certain class, of certain caste, and of certain color, particularly in the UK context, who were controlling and telling these stories. Now we've moved to a moment where literally you could produce, as we all know, from our smartphones and from our bedroom, that idea of the bedroom DJ or the bedroom influencer with a few contraptions. And actually you can have now mobile production units, which are your kind of team. Whereas before in the old age, we needed kind of big studios, and to some extent we still do. But as you know, those on Instagram, on TikTok and so forth have their own kind of mini setups. And that's how they kind of provide and move forward. But I also want to situate my 5 minutes in the landscape of the last 2-3 years, and why digital media, and why we need to think about digital media in terms of its past, present, and future, where it might be going in terms of representation, where it might be going in terms of ideology and content, is so important. Well, over the last 2-3 years, as we all know, we lived through, those of us who were lucky and fortunate enough, we survived through a pandemic. And in some case, we're still living with the ramifications of that. During the pandemic, we saw digital media usage, both for information, misinformation, and the sharing of new content rise exponentially. Interestingly, though, whereas Netflix is doing quite well in different parts of the world, and it'd be interesting to see and hear how it might be doing in India, but in the UK of late, the subscription numbers are now dipping. So is this that as we're coming out of the pandemic, as people are moving back to other forms of old entertainment or old media, as it were, what are the subscription models for these new digital media and this digital landscape? The last few years have also been important because the pandemic also helped us tell stories in interesting and different ways. So what kinds of stories came out of this, if you like, crisis moment that global humanity was going through? Alongside the pandemic, we also saw the global health and environment crisis, which had been going on for a number of years, but became exacerbated over the last few years. More globally, we saw movements such as Black Lives Matter, which coincided during the pandemic. We saw Time's Up, the women's and gender movement across Hollywood, but its proliferations in different industries as well. The LGBT movement was very prolific as well. And also issues around caste and caste matters was also prolific. So why am I mentioning these? Well, these were pivotal moments for us to think about how digital media responded to these issues, both in terms of representation, both in terms of galvanizing these in terms of political, social, cultural movements, but also who were the people telling the stories? Did we go to our conventional news channels, or were we actually looking through different portals of information? And this is where misinformation also came through, whether it was misinformation about coronavirus and its effect, or misinformation about various racisms and so forth, or actually whether it was people bypassing that in different and interesting ways. And also, was digital media experienced similarly or differentially by all? I would argue, and I think the data supports this, it was very, very much differentially, not least in terms of class. We just have to look at India and its demographics in terms of its tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 status. And also think here about the jugaad cultures, the piracy cultures, the ways in which people were hacking. And there's a term which comes from kind of a new media study about thinking about digital media, of how we not just only watch the media, engage with it, but perhaps we're using it and doing interesting and different things with it, from hacking through reusing it. And this is where I just really want to, in the last 2-3 minutes that I've got, is just think about how we might, as scholars, as students, as researchers, and as critical, discernible producers of digital media, think about that history. So we've got this history of the kind of the analog to the digital, and we could kind of trace that anything from, if you like, the post-war period in the UK to post-war period to the last 20-30 years in India. This could certainly be done from pre-independence to post-independence, and particularly of liberalization from the mid to late 90s and onwards. But also what's interesting here is thinking about debates and terms from film studies. So what's happened to things like the audience? Think here, and let's not forget television studies as well as here, because we're now looking at screens. Here I am talking to you through a webcam, through the wonders of the internet technology via my laptop, and we're connected in this space today. So television studies is also interesting in the notion of how screens, from smartphones to tablets to PCs, also are part of this mediated and digital landscape. And then, of course, there are issues such as, terms such as remediation. So this point, coming back to what Beduria says, that digital media isn't just something that new, but actually it perhaps draws on technology that we've used in the past, whether this was facsimile technology, whether this was Morse code, whether this was binary code, which then became more digital, which then gave us more opportunities. And here then, so thinking about it technologically and thinking about how we might study it from the past, present, and future, let's now think about the issues this gives us in terms of the ideas and the representations. So is the digital media landscape giving us this sense of proliferation, this sense of access to different identities of where we are, here in the UK, connected to India through the diaspora, or in India through our various regions, and how we can tell different kinds of stories? But also, in what ways are dominant forms of oppression and structure still in place that we need to think about? In what ways are some of the big global conglomerates still part and parcel of running the digital media scape? And in what ways can people really bypass and tell their stories in plural ways, which allow them to allow their voices to be authentic, but also allow their voices to reach beyond their bubbles? So the digital media landscape in the context of India 75 is an opportunity absolutely for celebration, but also critical celebration, pause and thinking. And with that, I hope I've come to my 5-7 minutes, and I'll pass back over to Beduria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajendra, for that. Those were very interesting provocations. Indeed, we need to think about, what should we term as an audience anymore, and that question. Also, the sort of historic trajectory of that question, because if you go back to the mid 20th century, when the television debate was going on, film and television, which was another question about the crisis of the audience, right? Because it made it, domestic and individuated. And so somewhere we are again coming back to similar concerns, but to in a completely different context, and so on. Okay, so I think we will try to connect to Madhujyoti again. Okay, so I guess she's still having trouble in getting connected. So I think we will shift to the next panelist. Professor Parthasarathi, is it okay for me to? Yeah, okay. So let me introduce to you Professor Vibodh Parthasarathi, who is an associate professor at the Jamia Millia Islamia University at the Center for Culture, Media and Governance. He is also the CMDS non-resident fellow, Central European University. Professor Parthasarathi has been one of the absolute sort of one of the most important figures in researching media policy and media business in India from a multidisciplinary perspective. His edited works are stellar, something that we all go to, especially in the recent years. There is a double volume Indian Media Economy, which I think he edited with S.V. Srinivas, as well as Platform Capitalism in India, which is quite a magnificent edited anthology. So we would want him to, bring us an insight into the sort of both policy as well as the business question, the sort of media ecology question into today's panel. Over to you, Professor Parthasarathi.
Thanks very much, Chair, for having me here. And it's a very, very provocative note that was circulated by your team, both as a description of the panel and as a brief to the panelists here. And since I have 5 minutes, I will sort of quickly make 4 points here, all of which deal with the kind of intellectual and disciplinary concerns that for me stem from your excellent note here. I think the first point is that there is a large share of scholarship around the digital media cultures, which I would now call for the next 5 minutes DMCs. A large part of that scholarship is highly presentist in its preoccupation. It's triggered by happenings and mishappenings and personalities that mark our time here. And this is perhaps common both to domestic and diasporic scholarship here. So, for example, over the last few years, there's been a profusion of publications on cultures of digital political communication around elections. If these are not thick enough, then such research may analytically and methodologically impede grasping the past of such practices here. Secondly, the presentist approach does not help much in identifying elements of continuity here. So for me, questions would be, how do long-standing practices marking the Indian media landscape, such as informality, audience fragmentation, monopolization, how have these shaped the DMC? Some contributors in my recent book on platform capitalism, which we talked about, have sought to historicize the platform phenomenon, rather than simply considering the digital practices spawned by commodity, entertainment, and governance platforms as being totally novel forms of market systems. And I think moving away from this presentist sort of obsession would also help us ponder over questions of the periodization of the Indian media culture, which is again something that the note rightly underscores. The second big point is about my observation of kind of medium-centric approach that still dominates both teaching and scholarship on the digital media. This is most obvious, for example, in studies on the news media, which continue to imagine newspapers, broadcast news, and online journalism as distinct fields here. These three sides of journalism seem to have got associated with three shifts in our post-colonial political economy. In fact, for me, there is a clear celebration of these shifts in almost all research. So there's a big celebration in the shift from newspapers to broadcast news 30 years ago, and more recently from broadcast news to online journalism. And I would be, in a sense, very cautious to try and celebrate these shifts here. Excuse me. Our medium-centric approach also tends to limit examining DMCs within the wider media economy, and more importantly, within the still wider mediated economy, which in a sense is also a characteristic of India of the last 1 decade. The third sort of concern for me is that there ought to be greater concern on matters of justice in research of the DMC. In addition to Rajendra's most welcome emphasis on who is telling the stories, I would like to ask, whose digital media cultures are we studying? And this is vital if we recognize the many ways in which digital media cultures have unfolded in India's highly stratified economic geography. And therefore, for me, the question here would be that, what is the idea of public interest that informs scholarship on the DMC? So, for instance, for many years, this kind of emphasis was located in popular and populist discourses around the digital divide. Okay. But I think there's a need to broaden this, looking beyond the digital divide, to talk about questions of digital disposition. Graham Murdoch, in a recent work of his, has talked about this. So, for example, our fellow citizens who are making a living in factories that produce digital service and digital goods are also the ones who are at the margins of digital media practices commonly studied by all of us. Another example, studies on the impact of digitization on the news have predominantly looked at newsrooms and business models. But how has digitalization reshaped the labor and work of the already precarious large number of news stringers across the Indian economy? That's sort of third concern I have there. And the last one is sort of more a kind of grouse I carry as a student of media policy in the long career, and one who looked at digitization across multiple sites in the media economy. So these kind of intellectual pursuits of media culture, the study of media culture, and the study of media policy have traditionally been distanced in India, both in teaching and in research. There could be an argument that such a distance has been a consequence of the ways in which perhaps dominant streams of cultural studies and methodological approaches in media education, both of which have tended to prioritize the study of representation and practices over that of institutions and structures. And this seems to have pulled our field in sort of opposite directions, in terms of both theoretical and methodological preoccupations. And for me, therefore, the question would be forward-looking in terms of how can this needless gap be plugged? One way perhaps could be for the study of DMCs to be more centrally engaged with institutional questions there. And by that, I mean the questions about the constraints and opportunities catalyzed by the state and how they reflect in our own practices there. Another way could be for students of media policy, and this is implicating some of us, to move away from our rational choice lineages to engage with the embeddedness of India's media culture. And this is again something which the previous panelists have thought about. I'll stop right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Partha. That was indeed
Real bad sound, Bedoria. There's a real interference sound.
Yeah, there was some sort of an interference.
I think every time you put your microphone on, there's a bad interference, a very bad interference. Can you mute the microphone? Mute the microphone. That's better. Bedoria, back to you.
I think the interference is coming from Obijadi there. I think there's a lot of static noise that is coming. We can't hear you, but we can hear a lot of static noise. So I guess there is some problem with the audio connection itself.
Just say Supriti, my colleague.
My colleague Supriti, I think, will give you a call, Madhujadi, if you can hear me. Yeah, and see if you can, figure it out with her. I can't hear you at all. No. Okay, so to come back to Dr. Parthasarthi's very thought-provoking discussion about, so those are the provocations that we need to keep in our mind, and we will come back to that during the question answer session. These are very, very important thing to think about. For example, the idea of institution in digital media. I guess one of the ways of historicizing, I mean, from my perspective, one of the problems of the reasons why we don't think about institutions so much with digital media is because of the very beginning of the sort of digital media, writing about digital media and the sort of narrative around digital media that was created in the 1970s onwards in US, which was this sort of libertarian, anti-institutional, free internet discussion, where it has produced this sort of, this binary, which perhaps is false, between the the free, the digital as the free and unfettered and so on. There are these adjectives that come back in almost all works about digital media. On the other hand, We are all aware of the the sort of institution and institutional interventions into the question of the digital media, ranging from internet blockout in certain places, which is fast becoming a dominant state sort of device of, I don't know, control, but also the question of digital sovereignty, which is doing its rounds around the world. Various states want to talk about it, but that again beggars the question that it almost produces this narrative that the state doesn't have sovereignty over this sort of unfetteredness, this sort of boundaryless thing, and that needs to have boundaries. And we probably need to question those easy narratives, those easy ways of making sense of things. Okay, so as Madhujari is still having problem, let's shift to Dr. Bibhuti Duggal. Bibhuti is an assistant professor at the Ambedkar University, Delhi. She's a very old friend. We have been, I've been fortunate to know her for quite some time now. She's one of the most acute, film scholars of our generation. She was awarded her PhD in cinema studies from the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And her work has been published in edited anthologies and journals like from Sage, Taylor Francis, Oxford University. And I would ask all of you to check out their recently co-edited volume called Film Studies and Introduction, which is perhaps the first book that has been written to introduce the very idea of film studies in India to to a large student base for the first time. It's a very, very important path-breaking kind of work. She also looks after the very important film journal that we have, Bioscope. So with that, Vibhuti, I hand it over to you.
Thank you both. I'm really, really flattered with that introduction, and I'm not sure that it really belongs to me, but thank you. And thank you for asking me to join you today on and with a panel which I have grown up reading. So I've cut my teeth as a research scholar in sort of reading my panelists, and so it's quite an honor to be here. I'm going to put together a few points primarily from the context in which I work, which is around audio media and histories of audio media. And I feel that I am one of the people guilty of what we both pointed out, which is sort of turning our attention to or focusing on the question of practices, or at least trying to focus on the question of practices rather than representation. So my comments on audio media and the question of digitalization within Indian media perhaps are prompted by a few things that certainly emerge in the here and now and in the present. So for example, the importance of voice-based applications on the mobile phone, the emergence of listening devices or transformations of mobile phones into listening devices in the form of Google Assistants, but also in the form of smart speakers, a world which has Alexa and Siri and and Cortana and so on and so forth, and which is, while certainly perhaps a world that is in the Indian context predominantly, at least as far as smart speakers is concerned, predominantly it's one that belongs to the more elite portions of Indian society. Voice-based applications, on the other hand, I think particularly as available on the mobile phone, have had a far greater purchase and a far more widespread use, particularly if you across classes. I'm thinking here predominantly of urban environments, but I imagine it also to some extent spills across. So that leads me to then questions of overlap between digitality and orality. Orality here, not with an AU, but orality here with an O. So what is it, particularly with questions of voice-based applications, with questions of sound, and the rise of these kinds of applications? Is it allowing for a bypassing, especially in certain classes and certain communities, of a quote unquote process of literacy in the sense of reading and writing? And how is this working out? What does it mean for us to think? So it's what are these kinds of questions of overlap? And that brings us also to some extent to something that came up in the concept note, which is questions of both a sense of a historical of the digital, but also, or not just of the digital in and of itself, but also of questions of continuity and discontinuity across a longer durée, in especially when we consider something like sound, broadly speaking, whether we think about the voice or we think about music, and what that means for, or what that means specifically in the context of the digital, especially now that we have started talking of the digital not just in terms of production, not just in terms of the appearance or disappearance of questions of materiality, but we started speaking about the digital in terms of the emergence of the algorithmic, especially with platforms. And what does it mean when we start thinking about the relationship between sound and the algorithmic, particularly in and from spaces such as India? Also, when I say what of the digital and of sound, and I invoke India in the same terms. So the question that was alluded to by the chair in just before I started speaking was the question of national sovereignty and what it does to the digital, and nowhere perhaps did it become more evident than in the case of most recently, or somewhat recently, than in the case of TikTok and the ban on TikTok by the Indian government in just about 2 years ago now. So it's within this within this frame that I'd like to just briefly remark upon, just give you a very broad stroke kind of historical perspective of a particular relationship between music and the digital in India. And in this case, I would sort of take perhaps a more like a 30-year kind of broad scale rather than a 40-year one. So because in a certain sense, one of the earliest moments of digitalization for music in India starts taking place with the mid-late 1990s and the early 2000s. So about the last 30 years or so. So in some senses, it starts at the site of the music industry, right? We're familiar with narratives of production, the creation of the recording and creation of a database of sounds. We're familiar with other transformations that took place that affected not just the broader, not just the film music industry, particularly as we know it. And by the film music industry, I'm thinking across regions. So I'm not just thinking of Hindi films and Hindi film music industry, but also how this influenced the music industry across linguistic contexts and regional contexts. And similarly, adjacent practices that brought the entire industry, that brought the industry together, whether it was, for example, in the figure of, DJs using pirate softwares, MP3s, and so on. to all the way to other moments. So if we move from, if this became de rigueur, if these kinds of transformations became de rigueur, when we were thinking about the music industry, there were concomitant changes in the ecologies of listening, right, and the consumption of music. So from the emergence of the mobile phone as one of the more dominant playback devices for listening, to the importance of platforms such as YouTube and WhatsApp, which also participated in longer histories of consumption of music, shared continuities with, for instance, older, groups of which part of, say, listening clubs in earlier times, and what and how they also understood the very changing nature of how they were listening, when we looked across some of these changes, right? So some of the emergence of some of these platforms, so coming in. Broadly, I think that brings me almost to the end of my 5-6 minutes of time. And this is a very brief, very sketchy history of some of the kind of key moments that I would probably tune into. And think about all of these moments in the context of these new questions that the digital is throwing at us. So on that note, thank you, Vaidya, and back to you.
Welcome, Vibhuti. That was really interesting, especially the question of orality. I was just thinking about the long history. Interestingly, it seems the person who started this argument was V.I. Lenin, who argued that cinema is an important medium because people, Russians are they didn't have literacy. So that relation between the significance of a medium and the question of orality, which has sort of dominated states' relation to many of these mediums for so long, much before liberalization and digitalization and all of that, and how that question again comes back with the sort of as the digital capitalism tries to reach the last cultural mile, wants to go deeper and deeper as it is reaching into the vernaculars, the dialects, but also the question of the sound and audio and so on. That's a very important and interesting thing to think about. But I think by now we are all eagerly waiting for Modulaji. So,
do you hear me finally? Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Wait a minute. Let me. I have to mute one of the. Do you hear me now? No.
Yes,
yeah?
we can hear you.
Perfect. So, I am very embarrassed, first of all, but this is what digital media is. That's how it works, and what I wanted to talk about is basically respond to the kind of note that Mojujo has thrown up, and respond to especially to my previous speakers, particularly Rajinder. So I will talk about cinema practices, and I'm trying to understand. In that regard, in fact, I had a kind of a PPT. If I could share, let me see if it is shareable. Do you see it? Fantastic.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, from the current slide. So yeah, perfect. What I wanted to, basically addressing Boituju's note and actually the organizers' note about how to historicize, and I find that extremely interesting that by now actually it is like one of my friends' son had responded that he had seen a floppy and he said that you took a 3D print of the save icon. So yeah, the floppy is the 3D print of the save icon. So, but I remember when we were doing research and all that, and when we talk about digital, it is indeed on 20 years. So in that regard, we have discussed and exactly what we want to bypass or we want to skip that part is the various kinds of conversations that we've had around technological transformation, the easy availability of consumer technologies. And I myself have written about the local video industries and about music video industries, but also in the context of what we need to address perhaps is in the context of the pandemic, that the emergence of new viewing portals and the major shift in the viewing cultures, that major films are online and therefore a relationship with viewership. But yeah, we know about the evolving relationship with the media forms. If we had also, I think one of the points that I would like to raise, and these are connected but different points, is that digital platforms and the digital media is a huge kind of an archive and a repository of the older media. And during the pandemic in particular, my research, my archive has been the YouTube, let's say, and the films that are available in the fragmentary forms, and we can begin to think about what does it mean to find a material on the digital platform, and how does one do the research. In fact, not only the Indian Cinema.ma kind of project, but the kind of vast material that may be available. So it is basically about manifold engagements. That is like the part one, but obviously we are talking about, we've had many discussions on aesthetics, on circulation. Films have been made in as early as to 2001, and about the materiality and the absence of it, the digital data, and basically the end of cinema as we knew it. And this sort of auto colorization of Potter Pachali could be one of the interesting ways of understanding what digital practice means in our context. So I want to focus in draw your attention, and I've been thinking, because I've been on and off various film festivals with my film, that along with the video industries that we talk about in the context of cinema practices, is the growth of independent cinema with the DSLR camera that is available. And especially there is a discussion about the democratization of the media fields, the successes of films like Sexy Durga or Pebbles internationally. So on one hand, there isn't any structure as such about looking into the digital practice. We are still talking about conceptually, but it is hard to talk, historicize it in the ways in which we historicize or periodize cinema or cinema practices. That apart, I was looking at the ways in which independent cinema practice with the availability of digital technologies become meaningful. So these are some of the screenshots of, let's say, the International Film Festival of Kerala, in which my film was also there. So there was Indian Cinema Now category, Malayalam Cinema Today category, and then let's say Kolkata Film Festival that just got over yesterday. So there is an Indian language films category. There is a Bengali panorama category. There is also a short film category, and also something called Unheard. But I am beginning to think, how are films being made? What is digital practice? How are, media products being circulated? Those are the questions. And as I look, especially to this kind of new formations and media cultures, I'm thinking of collaborations and networks, and it seemingly seems, it constantly seems to me that on one hand, while we are talking about democratization, much of the cinema field, the sort of expanding independent cinema field that we are talking about, exceptional films that we have seen, let's say I have been watching in the last few weeks or days, is operating like what I yesterday said, like a boys band, in the ways in which a cinematographer, a music composer, a editor, they come together. And if we go back again, looking into the names, and it is really hard to find, despite there are certain caste and gender that you will constantly find. These formations are happening. This is just one screenshot, but you can see that these.
Madhusari, sorry for interrupting you, but the presentation has not gone ahead of the floppy and the save icon thing. So
Okay, then
yeah,
I'll
now
just
we can
end,
save. Yeah, yeah.
I'll just end it, and I will quickly run through it. This So I was talking about all these, and mm, yeah, this is important. The end of cinema as we knew it and growth of independent cinema. So and the kind of screenshots that I want to show from the major film festivals and the names and the formations that are happening. So in that regard, what I want to talk about, that on one, or alert the researchers and friends present here, that on one hand we talk about a sort of a rhizomatic growth of the video industry in across not only South Asia but across global South. On the other, it is important for us to understand that how are these cameras, these gadgets, what kind of cameras, what kind of gadgets, what is the local video industry, how is it circulating, what kind of phones, that I mean these technologies are marked by communities, by gender, by the availability of what kind of cameras are available to certain class, communities, or gender, or people. So those are the questions that I want to talk about, especially about the circulation, about the democratization. Digital has been seen as a democratization process, and here I want to actually alert our friends about the vast number of media material that actually circulates outside the kind of circuits that have been created. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Madhujadi. After a lot of, as we always say, we notice digital media only when it stops working. So today we recognize the digital media quite a lot. Thank you for that. Yes, that I mean, and to go back to what you were talking about, this. On one hand, what quite apparently looks like a democratization of the industry, the machine, the filmic machine, the recording machine, which again has been such a sort of a long running source of anxiety for filmmakers. Like I saw that you had a PPT slide with the Piero Le Fou images, and Godard himself he's very well known for um, endorsing video camera when the video camera and the Super 8s were coming out, that how they would democratize. And there is a very interesting sequence in his later film, I think 2004, called Notre Musique, our music, where he's shown taking part in this class of people. I think it was in Chechnya or Serbia, I forgot. But somebody asked, do you think that the video will be the liberation of cinema? And he remains silent, and the camera zooms in, and that's it. So that sort of that sort of dialectics between the idea that this hope of democratization, but it really somewhere always falls short of it.
Yeah, I also wanted to sort of emphasize that by now, it shows that by now the digital media forms has already consolidated, across various kinds of possibilities, that is film festival or, website or let's say the OTT platform. And cinema is principally digital now. There isn't in India, there is hardly any celluloid cinema left. So it is already consolidating, and that is something to alert ourselves as to what seemed like a spurt of democratization is consolidating through various kinds of discriminatory lines, which is gender, which is caste, which is community, and there are various platforms. Film festival is one, but the OTT is other. So we can immediately see that there is, all the video industries about which I had written, let's say 5 or 6 years back, they have kind of fizzled out, mostly producing music videos. So that is something that one needs to address, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you, Madhushan. So that's yes. So we need to think about all of those things. Once we start to ask the question of historicization and periodization, many questions, of course, open up with respect to digitalization. I mean, for example, question of something like what is digital death? At one level, there is no death on the digital due to the nature of the storage, but there is certain kind of very quick obsolescence. Things just come and go, trends just come and go and vanish away into the huge bottomless pit of storage that the cyberspace is. So all of those questions come up. So I hope that as we open up the discussion now, we will have the time to get into this, have more discussions on this. But before that, as the chair of the panel, I think it's my duty to sort of give my the questions that all of you triggered in me. So I thought I will just start the question answer session by asking questions to all of you. So first of all, one of my first question is towards for Rajinder. I'll just go chronologically. Um, I was just wondering, one, as you were talking about OTT and Netflix and so on, one of the things that we have seen in India recently has been a huge explosion of vernacular OTTs. We are not yet sure how stable that trend is, how many of them will survive. Certainly only a few will survive in the long run. Yeah. But there has been, one can almost say that there has been even a speculative kind of business to do with OTT and so on. There is a market side to it and so on and so on. But what cannot be sort of denied is that there was, especially during the COVID pandemic, there was a huge expansion of vernacular OTTs, and content is now coming from all sorts of places. For example, Meerut, as far as I know, in North India has become a very major part from which Hindi language content is coming, which we don't see because, I mean, if you are I'm just assuming that you may not have the subscription to it, but there are all sorts of that kind of thing. So my question to you would be that what would be interesting to know is that, is there something similar happening in the United Kingdom as well, like the production of sort of vis-a-vis the sort of big brothers like the Netflix or the Prime or Hulu, vis-a-vis those, is there a creation of smaller OTTs, and how does the the BIPOC community get represented in that kind of space? First of all, does that space at all exist, or like doesn't? Or if it does, what is the sort of what is the sort of participation and representation the BIPOC community has in that? So should we start with just me asking the question and you answering, then me going to the other, or do you want me to?
No, it's just fine. It also depends on the time. So what might be nice is, given that there's so many people in the room, which is brilliant, we've got almost 260 people in the room, it's fantastic. I think what we'll do is we'll keep our questions and responses short and brief, everybody on the panel. And then if colleagues around, wherever they are, want to ask questions via the chat box or come on, I think it would be lovely to hear from them. So let me just respond quickly to your question, Badra. I think it's a lovely question. So yeah, so one of the things I think we think about the digital is how to kind of critically analyze and study the digital. And one way is the very question that you posed. So the last, and I deliberately use the last 2-3 years of the pandemic as an actual moment in time in the digital as a living repository of our history right now. It's a ripe area for us to do all kinds of internet research, classic-based research, to think about, well, actually, where is the digital going? What is our relationship to it? And what kinds of images and content came out of it as well? So it's a nice way of almost kind of stopping and pausing and saying, okay, when we talk about digital, what do we mean by the digital? Actually, for me, I'm going to look at the digital during this phase or this period, which could be long historical, or actually it could be historical within this moment of the last 3 to 5 years, say. And so in what ways is the vernacular model a sustainable model? One really hopes it is, but again, the data and the trends will show that. And will the vernacular be usurped by the Amazons, the Netflix, and the Z5s of this world, where they see, that's interesting, and so let's now try and produce kind of Hindi Urdu content, but with a bit of vernacular to try and kind of emulate that model. And that happens the world over, where there are kind of interesting subcultural trends, subcultural content, whether that's class, gender, politics, LGBT, whatever, and then somehow the mainstream usurps that. Within the UK context, what's really been happening is that people have been vociferous and active right from a very young teenage. So as soon as they've got kind of smartphones in their hands and they realize there's an Instagram, a TikTok culture, and a way to make my friends laugh and influence them, in inverted commas, that's where the content starts getting produced. And actually, even the big producers, you may or may not have picked this up in the global media, but the BBC is currently under threat right now. We're talking about whether it should have a license fee or not, or whether it should move to the pay-per-view model. So even something renowned the world over, the UK's BBC public service broadcasting model is now currently under threat amidst debates about deregulation. So what's happening is that in the past, I would say that young people particularly, or any kinds of media producing content, was the aim that I'll get so many traction, so many likes, and therefore then I'll enter the mainstream. And that has happened for some, where they then crossed over into the BBCs, into the ITV, where they got their shows or their celebrity. But actually, what people are realizing is that actually YouTube, Instagram is their platform to kind of almost not necessarily circumvent, but certainly work alongside as a parallel media or as a parallel culture. And I think that's where the tension lies, but also the possibilities for the creativity. And then, of course, that brings in all the various isms of racism, genderism, homophobia, and so forth. In what ways does that operate in these spaces when we move from the vernacular or the vernacular kind of rising up? Are these new exciting representations, insightful, cutting edge, or actually are they kind of reproducing the same, but in a different way that we might have seen in the conventional media? You're muted, Badra.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for that, Rajinder. I think we had a raised hand. Aarti, would you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
No, Aarti's gone quiet.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. They can also put in the chat box. So if they don't want to come on the mic, they can put their question in the chat box. And if not, then we can go to the other panelists' bedroom. Chair's prerogative.
Yeah, so we have a question from Preeta Chakraborty here. So let me read it out. This is for Madhujati, which is considering that there are fantastic independent films also coming from women, persons from non-normative gender identity, as well as from Dalit groups, the last especially in Tamil Nadu. Is it possible that it is not about availability or access to gadgets, but rather to networks, caste, class, institutional networks that operate in and determine the lineups of these film festivals? We can also see alternative film festivals coming up largely online, but also offline to address this lacuna, often under various umbrella identities. Can we think of this not as a particularity of digital media, but how cinema has historically been produced and distributed and in India? Secondly, is it possible to imagine a reformation / democratization of the mainstream festival space rather than alternative formations?
Thank you, Pritha. What I precisely that's what I wanted to emphasize, the networks. Who has the camera, who knows how to edit, who is a musician, who can perform, precisely those kinds of networks that are marked by various things, including your gender, your from where you come, your caste, your class, various things, but also training, so you may not have a musician friend to help you out, or an editor friend. So these, but what I wanted to actually say, that of course it is as you are saying, that there are films, precisely that is the point. And if technology had allowed, I would have played one brief clip from there. I had it ready. So of course that's precisely the point, that there is material, but the consolidation of what is let's say a major film of the year, what is the most important film of the year, what is the most exciting film of the year, because now everybody has the technology. It is the network that has to be as though you have to break through that. So that is precisely why I mentioned that it operates like a boys band, that you have to have a group, as it were, some kind of a network. And institutions are a network, actually. Or the institutions that we come from are also allow us to form those networks. And so that's precisely, I mean, boys band is a way of saying in a provocative way, to energize the discussion. But precisely it is not whether you have a cell phone with a camera, or whether you can make a film, or whether you can make an alternative film, but how to, let's say, make a complete film, where the film will go, how, so on. And about the mainstream festivals, that's a, I mean, really larger questions. But I think the alternative is, in my understanding, is that just as there are a range of alternative film practices, there are a range of alternative festivals which are circulating, which are already here for almost 10 years. So that itself is I think, breaking the barriers. But it is precisely that kind of networks that I want to draw attention to, as we try to understand what this practice has been over the, let's say, 20 years.
Thank you, Madhujyoti. Audience, please write your comments in the chat, or if you want to ask it directly, please raise your hand and you can ask the question directly. In the meanwhile, I had this question. I mean, this was triggered by what Professor Patel.
Someone's raised their hand. There's somebody, Swati,
yeah,
can you see them?
Yeah, Swati, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Please mention the panel member you are directing the question to.
Right. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So my question is to Vibodh Parthasathi sir, and he had mentioned about labor in his 4 points that he had raised. Oh, okay. So my name is Swati Bakshi, and I'm from Westminster University in London, and I'm a PhD candidate. So I've been a journalist for a long time with BBC World Service and All India Radio and Doordarshan as well. So I just wanted to give a context to the question of labor that you were mentioning, and precisely from the perspective of journalists, because this is one of the most, I think, ignored area of digitization in India, of newsrooms particularly, how the transition has actually happened. In the sense that because all of us like who started in 2007 and 8, and I'm not going backwards in the sense 1980s or 90s when everything actually transformed, but the transition that really happened. So that happened in 2007, 8, 9, 10, gradually when newsrooms were digitized, and particularly I take example from BBC in India, where all of us were used to working for shortwave, and then it went on to become digital kind of production, and then mobile first news. All of that happened, and how people who were trained in a certain kind of media production had to suddenly adjust to new forms of productions and engaging with audience in a certain manner. So there was no longer this idea of you are centrally placed in an institution, you have this top-down model of production where people do write to you the letters that they write to you and tell you whether they liked it or not. But you are suddenly in this position of a broadcaster or a producer who's this kind of legacy producer. So there was this change of, not just material practices, there was also this change of emotional labor that goes into producing material and news gathering and putting everything together. So as a producer, it meant a lot for me to go from a traditional sort of production to digital production and thinking about mobile audience, because mobile audience was something that came really, it became really tough for people who were working with a different idea of audience, who knows them and who is actually in relationship with them with their constant letters and feedback and phone calls. Here suddenly you are dealing with an audience whose taste you're not sure of. So the question of labor and production, not only from the perspective of this new kind of content creation landscape where you have influencers and that's a different kind of digital economy that erupted, but sort of that that I would say intermedial connections of production. How do you see that? I mean, do you think there is enough study in that aspect of how that transition has actually happened?
Yeah, if I may, Chair.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So thanks for this. I mean, it's so thanks also to acknowledge the fact that labor in the press has not really been studied enough. So of course, the big question there is the kind of de-skilling and reskilling that has been precipitated by digitization. So that part is in a sense the kind of understudied part beyond business models, and actually also what happened inside the newsroom. So the kind of de-skilling and reskilling that happens in the newsroom, which is the formal sphere. And I was in a sense trying to allude to the kind of de-skilling and reskilling which is happening outside the formal spheres as we go down the production chain and look at the most precarious forms of labor. So that's in a sense what I was trying to invoke. The second point which you mentioned towards the end is about dealing with audiences whom they're not really sure about. And in a sense, for me, perhaps this goes back to the newspapers in the 19th century. Were they aware of the audiences that they were talking to? Or even going back to sort of satellite television. How aware were they of the kind of audiences they were talking to? And perhaps that's where the kind of bidirectionality brought about by digital networks has given some idea to those in the newsroom about who their audiences is. Yeah. The question, of course, there is that this kind of feedback on audiences is also highly mediated, precisely by the kind of sort of networks, in the sense that enable this kind of feedback. Yeah. So we do know more about audiences, what they like, what they dislike, how they move from one side to the other. But is that information what a journalist wants to know about their audiences? Yeah. So we have this sort of, a kind of information paradox in that sense, what I've called there, that you have tremendous information about audiences, but is that information relevant to those who are producing news? Yeah. To those who are investing in news, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that perhaps would be my frame to actually try and look at the kind of problem that you are raising here. And then, of course, I mean, the last part that, that kind of research, of course, is extremely important. Yeah. It's difficult. It involves a difficult kind of field work rather than just sort of sitting in newsrooms or doing interviews with those who are designing business models. Yeah. But perhaps that's the kind of the margins of the digital news economy that we need to know much more about here, precisely because there are issues of justice, in a sense, which are embedded there.
Thank you, Professor Parthasarathy. And before I move on to the question in the chat, since we are talking about the labor at your four provocations, I had one question which I thought I have to ask, which is you're talking about shifting from and kind of talking about digital divide to digital disposition, which of course reminds one of primitive accumulation, disposition, and so on. And so that is very thought-provoking, as we shift from one digital technology to another. For example, how we have shifted from sort of computer-based internet to the smartphone. Aren't these also a sort of moments of a certain kind of broader dispositions and so on? But anyway, that's not the question I wanted to ask. The question I simply had is that since you are talking about disposition, talking about institutions, we need to talk about institutions in the digital media, and you have worked on platform capitalism. So it's a very broad question, but the question for you is that what is the state of platform capitalism? Because historically, every mode of production in capitalism as we know it would have a certain kind of relationship with a certain generic model of state at the same time, right? So what I mean, of course, that's not a settled question. I know there is no settled answer, but what are the kind of states that are emerging because platform capitalism exists, and what are the kind of sort of policies that are coming up? What are the sort of what are their general directions? How do we theorize at a very general level the state that accompanies platform capitalism in today's India as well as the world?
Yeah. So thanks very much for this. I mean, this is also connects with the intervention which I wanted to make earlier when you talked about the idea of the media as a kind of speculative activity, or that at least the word which you use. Now, of course, for me, the kind of mass media has always been a speculative activity, right from the early years of Hollywood and so on and so forth, and comes to other sectors as well. The last sort of round of speculation we saw was in the broadcast industry in the 1990s and 2000s, where everybody was punting about this. And of course, this has then got augmented with the different types of actors who are now speculating in what we call the platform economy. Okay, these are Silicon Valley players. These are players from China. These are players which have been brought together by consortiums from within India. So in a sense, for me, this kind of speculative lineage of the media is something very well playing out when we talk about the idea of platform capitalism here. The second aspect there is the issue of the relationship between the state and platform capitalists here. Okay. Again, that relationship in a sense has many parallels to the past here. There is one relationship of the interventionist state here. Okay, and therefore trying to sort of shape platforms in the personality of particular kind of states here. So, TikTok, in a sense, what was sort of evoked earlier, that's an example of the way in which the Indian state wants to impress upon its own personality on a certain kind of interactive platform there. Similar things, of course, are happening in China, Russia, and perhaps very strongly in different ways in Western Europe as well there. The other response of the state to platforms is what in a different kind of context, I'd call that a response of considered silence here, which means that the state chooses not to intervene at certain sites of the value chain of the platform here. Okay, and that in a sense then provides or results in a particular kind of dynamics that platform sort of moves into. So both looking at forms of intervention and silences by the state, in a sense, that's what results in the kind of platforms that we encounter. These are not entities which exist a priori in that sense. Yeah. And for me, perhaps that would be a more potent way of looking at the state's role in shaping a particular personality of platform capitalism, which could be perhaps relatively unique to India. Yeah. The last part, of course, of that which is in a sense the kind of big argument I've made elsewhere, that platforms essentially are market systems there, and they have sort of reformulated pre-existing ways in which markets have functioned there. So they are not necessarily producing new commodities and services there. They are reformulating the markets of pre-existing commodities, tangible commodities, non-tangible commodities, the way in which social interaction happens here. So it's not that social interaction was not happening before the advent of Facebook here, but Facebook has then reformulated that market of the social and given it a particular kind of rendition there. Again, going back to the issue of, let's say, governance platforms here. So when we talk about money platforms or biometric identity platforms, the state has been involved in the realm of money and in the realm of identity for a long period of time. Okay, but platform capitalism, in a sense, then tends to reformulate not just the priorities of the state, but the way in the state sort of chooses to collaborate with certain kind of actors, both market actors, and I may also act extra market actors in reformulating these platforms. Yeah. So that for me, in a sense, is perhaps the kind of more rounded way of looking at platform capitalism, rather than getting perhaps seduced only by the kind of affordances that platforms tend to provide us as users.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Parthasarathy. There are two questions in the chat. Both are for all the panelists, whoever wants to respond. The first is from Professor Swapna Gopinath. She writes, thank you for the interesting discussion. I was thinking about the culture of political branding over digital media spaces. The proliferation of such patterns is quite overwhelming. Would you like to comment on this? Any panelists? Yeah. And the second question comes from Ayman Siddiqui, who writes, hello, thank you so much for this interesting session. Is it possible to elaborate just a little bit specifically on, if I may call it, cultural imperialism and homogenization by global conglomerates in terms of entertainment industry and platform economy? And what are the commercial interests embedded in this? How has Netflix and Amazon Prime tried to make it ways in the Indian market? So that's Ayman's question. And so political branding and the sort of global hegemony of Amazon and Netflix.
Bebdi, do you want to say anything? But if you don't want to, that's fine. But maybe an opportunity for Bebdi to come in as our panelist. Can you hear us, Bebdi? Oh, I think she's gone. Is she there? No, just I mean, I'll say a couple of things there, and then maybe people can and also say stuff on some of that. I think what the interesting thing about Netflix and Amazon is a little bit of a conundrum, because let's not forget they're an industry just like any other, the cement industry. Okay, but what's interesting is that entertainment is now globally considered quite huge, and particularly in the developing sectors as well, in the developing economies and the developing world. It has been for a while, but I think this has been proliferated over the last 20 years. And so it's no accident then, and I think this is where the interesting conundrum is. Netflix and Amazon and the Z5 have been that space, maybe less so Z to an extent, but maybe in the vernacular fields, but certainly on the mainstream platforms of Netflix and Amazon, these have allowed more diverse sense of representation, perhaps on the surface of it. Okay, so here we've seen interesting stories, daring stories sometimes, which have partly drawn from subcultural roots or from storytellers and from independents, which then they've kind of brought together. And we see this in the kind of ensemble stories, you know, Love in Mumbai, love stories, Gili Butchi, Ajib Dastans, those kinds of examples. And what happens in those is we get some very daring content, daring scripts that perhaps mainstream cinema or only pockets of mainstream cinema would have only ventured into. But here it becomes an economic model to push the envelope, to think about issues of gender, of class, of caste, of sexuality as potentialities for mainstreaming. But then here is also then the other side of that conundrum. So on the one hand, they've been putting out Black, Brown and BIPOC content around the world in ways which have challenged the mainstream providers. You know, in the UK context, that would be the ITVs, the independents and the BBCs and so forth. And Channel 4 even, to some extent, Channel 4 kind of lost its, I would argue, its radical kind of avant-garde in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. And now it's kind of, you know, it's still somewhere between there, but also playing around with the market needs and audience desires and wants. And so the Netflix model is also under threat now, as I said in my opening comments, because in the UK, the subscriptions are falling. Is this also happening in the Indian context? And is this partly due to jugaad culture, piracy culture, the things that some of us alluded to earlier, and Bebthi talked about auditory and other modes of hacking? Or actually, is it that because we're perhaps stably or slowly coming out of the pandemic, that people's notion of where they're spending their money, their limited money, but also what's available to them as entertainment and leisure is also a kind of an interesting thing that we need to think about in the mix. So on one sense, the global imperialism on the surface is being challenged by the diversity and range of stories and ways in which that storytelling happens. But I think what needs to also be seen is whether that model is sustainable and how it might affect, say, the PSBs or the more dominant content providers, if at all, or actually in what ways can the Netflix, the Amazons and the Zs of this world and the other platforms enable that to continue. And I think that's why, for me, it's partly a conundrum, but also a challenge to issues of imperialism and associated ideas there.
Thank you so much, Rajendra. Anybody else wants to comment on the platform thing? And also, any of you want to pick up the political branding issue that Dr. Gopinath was?
Just two bits on the kind of platform thing, you know. So it's not accurate to put Netflix and Amazon in the same basket. Okay. Yes, of course, both of them produce movies. Yeah, but sort of to kind of invoke this sort of famous interview with the proprietor of the sort of Times of India gave to the New Yorker about 10 years ago, when they said that they are not in the news business, but they are in the ad business. Similarly, Amazon is not in the film business. Amazon is in the data business. And they also, of course, happen to produce films as one way in which to try and gather that. So when we're talking about these economic sort of relationships, I think what becomes important analytically is to try and pinpoint what the central product in question is. So if you think of the central product as the audiovisual industries, then we would get a different sense of the idea of accumulation of interests and monopolies and so on and so forth. Okay, and a different sense of diversity in a sense. On the other hand, if we think of the digital economy as where the primary product is data, then of course we get a very different sense of what the terms of exchange, terms of transactions, and of course the ways in which exploitation happens in the digital economy. And that in a sense is my kind of short answer to the question, and in a sense building up on the second part of what Rajinder had elaborated there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Parthasarathy. Before I go to, I think Rugved has his hands up, but before I go there, I just wanted to ask Vibhuti one question, the question I had, which is, you're talking about this question of how does the audience listen, right? So whenever we, we were also talking about the question of the audience. Early on, Rajendra was talking about what happens to the audience, and we see that there are whenever there is a transition since 20th century from one medium to another, there is a sort of there is a sort of there are modes of individualization of media experience, including listening, but at the same time it is also accompanied by newer attempts to imagine sort of collective way of doing it. How do we come together and do it, right? It seems to me that they happen kind of together, right? It's never just one or the other. So my question from that way is that do you see anything in today's contemporary sort of oral landscape, ways of coming together in the experience of sound and music?
Thanks, Vajra. That's an interesting question, because I think incidentally, to go back to the pandemic, so to speak, as a particular moment, I think there was a way in which there were ways of trying to organize and reorganize collectivities of listening and collectives of listening in online modes, and I think the collective versus the individual became a particular mode of engaging, particularly during the pandemic. And I think in that sense, this was not limited to listening, but it opened up to, and I'm thinking here of, watch together streaming services that came by initially sort of started as these open source apps that you could add in, plugins that you could just put onto your browser and so on, but very rapidly became things that Amazon and Netflix actually picked up, have these watch parties, etc. So I wonder if that's one kind of way in which new kinds of collective processes of listening, viewing, etc. are taking place. The other thing, and this is, I'm thinking out aloud almost, if I can take the luxury of doing that, which is, I wonder to what extent it is useful to think about broadly what might be private and public modes of, if I were to just bring back sort of antiquated language, to what extent it's useful to think about private and public modes of listening, and whether and what is the kinds of purchase that has, right, in the context of the digital. But yeah, because that's something I am not certain of, at least anymore. Given the, especially the kinds of directions that I think some of the studies on the digital kind of turns they've taken, we've come to almost accept, particularly in terms of practices and audiences and what audiences mean, right? We've come to accept audiences as data points. We've come to accept or recommendations as functioning in individuated ways, but also individuated ways not, I don't want to use configured by, but individuated, but at the same point of time also calibrated by the algorithm. Like, so there's a constant back and forth between a personalization and a lack of personalization. And I think it's interesting that it's, you know, it's now no longer it's not limited in some senses any longer to, if it ever really was, to say music that we listen to for entertainment, or music listened to as leisure, or even music as heard in terms of a background service, right? Because it's now moved into sleep zones and meditation zones. So there's a way in which it takes over life itself. So I'm struggling with, I think, thinking about what these contours now mean, or whether these terms are useful in that sense. I hope that partly addresses the question of audiences listening and practices that I think you were trying to ask me to think about.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti. We are kind of running late. We have extended quite a bit from the schedule, so I think now we will stop the question answer session for now. I think to wrap it up, what we can say is that in this very brief time, we have managed to raise a number of questions which should be, which should enable the students who are present here, or the researchers who are present here, to reformulate their perspective vis-a-vis the digital media. As we all know, that sometimes, probably, I mean, the most important act of any research is the act of formulating the question, to escape the easy questions, to escape easy narratives, and to make your research questions precise. And I hope in that direction we have taken a few steps. But anyway, we are short of time, so now I will hand it over to my colleague, to Hannah Sarasujan. So Hannah, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. I would now like to request Ms. Supriti Malhotra, the Assistant Professor and the AEP Faculty in charge at Symbiosis Center for Media and Communications, to give us an introduction of the film retrospective event and give us a brief overview of the event and the themes to be covered. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you all the panelists who took the time to join us for this discussion. I'm afraid that it's, we only had 20 minutes and we've already gone past it. I'm Supriti. I'm somebody who loves watching films, who loves making films, and also from the perspective of just joining academia and learning to articulate the study and analysis of cinematic nuances. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the film retrospective on Hrishikesh Mukherjee. I'm probably the kind of person who's watched more commercial cinema in terms of Hrishikesh Mukherjee's filmography. And the reason, I think, is because my parents are divorced. Years ago, they were separated. Years earlier, they were going through, the difficult aspects of a difficult marriage. But one thing that always was common was we would have the weekend movie specials. The family would come together, and whether it's Satya Pe Satta, Golmaal, I'm trying to remember all the names, forgive me. But Satya Pe Satta, Golmaal, Chupke Chupke, Khoobsurat, these are films that made me laugh, and they still do. The reason for that is I think it is about Hrishikesh Mukherjee's, ability to tell complicated stories about dysfunctional families, about communities trying to resolve conflict. Maybe it's just the fond memory of a child, and that's part of cinema, people finding escape through cinema, finding human and emotional connections through stranger stories. So that's, I think, generally looking for meaning in life and cinema. And as we begin celebrating the 100th birth anniversary of Hrishikesh Mukherjee. I hope that you enjoy the experience of some of the most cherished films of Hrishikesh Mukherjee. And before we begin, I'd just like to, have you watch a tribute montage to Hrishikesh Mukherjee and enjoy the festival. Thank you. Thank you. We are starting the festival with Satyakam, which is one of Hrishikesh Mukherjee's most famous and also one of his most favored films. And you should be within the next few minutes receiving the link. I also want to thank the National Film Archive of India, which has very kindly shared their copy of Satyakam with us. And I wish you a very happy, enjoyable experience watching the film, a nice evening, and I hope to see you on the 4th for our next session with Professor Gayatri Chatterjee, who will talk about Hrishikesh Mukherjee, and also SMM Osaja, who is going to talk to us about Hindi film, Indian film on India. So have a nice evening. And
thank you, everybody, again, and also Eid Mubarak to everybody. Thank you so much, and thanks to all the panelists for this wonderful, wonderful discussion. We from SCMC and BCU hope that we will have the occasion again to have a conversation like this, and probably for a longer duration and so on. So I think the journey will go on, as the show will go on, as Raj Kapoor used to say. And on that note, I think we can end the program. Thank you.
thank